Hello there, I'm Dr. Tyler Desplena, and this is my book, Foundations of Strongman Training. I've used my scientific training to perform brand new research studies on the sport of strongman and combined it with over a decade of personal experience competing in strongman and powerlifting to teach you how to train like the strongest people on earth. I've decided to make a video series on the content of the book. I'm going to share with you everything from how the book idea came to be to practical considerations for the insights gained from these scientific studies. By the end of this video series, you'll have the information you need to optimize your strongman training. Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of Foundations of Strongman Training. Today is episode 5, and I want to talk today about motion patterns. Them being one component of what is skill, the other one being effort patterns, which we'll talk about in the next episode. In case you missed the last episode, I tried to answer the question, what skills should a strongman athlete master, through the first study that I present in the book in chapter 2. And what I found there was that there was 74 unique strongman skills that amateur athletes in Ontario had to prepare for across a 5-year period. Now, I also went through those and found the foundational skills. So, those are the skills that happened every year, multiple times a year across the data set. And I call those foundational skills. Those ones are really important to master if you want to, train like a strongman or compete in strongman. So I would suggest you go back and take a look at those if you missed it. Also, they're laid out in the tables in chapter 2 for you there. So have a look and hopefully you're training those skills. All right, enough about last episode. Today, I want to go a bit deeper on skills and in particular motion patterns. So the question that I was curious about was, what is the distribution of motion patterns within the sport of strongman? Now, why I'm interested in that question is because if I know what the distribution is, then I can prioritize the motion patterns that I train accordingly. So that's the whole reason that I performed a study on this, that I was so interested in it, is that it allows me to have kind of like a prioritization framework. So that's what we're going to explore today. That is the contents of chapter 3 of the book, which are all focused on understanding motion patterns, and a little bit more deeply, which we'll get into, is classifying motion patterns into different groups or classes. Okay, so how we're going to come to understand what went on with this study, the results and everything, I'm going to lay that out here. First, I'm going to give you a bit of background information, and we're going to talk about skills and patterns, in particular motion patterns. Then we'll get into a bit of the study details, what was the thought process there, what data was used, so on and so forth. And then I'll discuss the results, any limitations of the study that we should note, and then give you some final conclusions about how you might use this knowledge to optimize your strongman training. Okay, so let's start the discussion here about skills and patterns. Previously, I defined a skill as the combination of a motion pattern and an effort pattern. So let's define each of those. A motion pattern in this context is just a set of positions that you have to move between, and that could be moving your body, could be moving the implements, or it could be some other reference point that's used. But basically, we have a set of positions that you need to complete in order to consider the task done or the skill as being completed. On the other side, you have effort patterns. Effort patterns describe forces. So, effort patterns describe the force patterns or force trajectories needed to move between each of those points that define the skill. So, if you're an engineer like me, you might think of movement patterns as kinematics of this system, and you think of effort patterns as the dynamics of the system. But in essence, that just means that patterns, whether they're motion or effort patterns, are just sets of things. If they're motion patterns, they're sets of positions. And if they're effort patterns, they're sets of forces. So that's the kind of headspace I want you to be in when we're discussing the rest of the details of this study. And in the study, the focus was on motion patterns. I wanted to kind of separate the two and analyze them individually. So this study was on motion patterns. In next episode, the next study, we'll talk about effort patterns. Okay, I want to make an important note here about patterns, which will help you understand the level of analysis that takes place during the study and kind of throughout the book. So, depending on your observation point, there's a finite but really large set of positions or forces that can constitute a skill. And then you can obviously break that down into just positions for motion patterns and forces for effort patterns. And the problem is that the human eye can't actually distinguish with any, statistical confidence between these different trajectories. And that's why typically when we're describing exercise or training, we're describing them at the level of the pattern. And that's exactly why in this analysis, the study, and kind of the outlook of the book is to stay at this level of pattern and then even aggregate patterns into different classes, which we're going to do in this study and the next one, and analyze them from that perspective. And it's simply just because humans, the human senses are not able to make sense and distinguish the differences between the patterns. So if I watch multiple repetitions of your deadlift, if we measured the, say, forces of the muscles, the positions of the joints, what we would see is like small deviations across those repetitions, even though if my eye looks at them and I would think, say, as a coach, oh, all of those look the same, they all look good, but there's going to be those deviations that are happening under the skin, under the surface, and our senses just can't discern those. So that's why we talk about, exercise at that kind of level of abstraction. I don't, when I say do a deadlift, I'm not drawing a force trajectory that I want your knee joint to follow. And then you have to try to execute that. Because the other problem, or the other reason why we do that, is because you're not able to execute at that level of fidelity either. You just execute at a higher level where I have to take the barbell from this position. I need to move it up to that position. My limbs need to do these kind of things at the end, and I get my down signal and I can put the barbell down. So now I have some personal experiences from my doctoral studies. To give you a little bit of background there, my doctoral degree was focused on modeling human motion and then using that to control robotic devices, in particular wearable exoskeletons that you could wear after, say, an injury and it help you rehabilitate, that kind of thing. Now, while I was doing, the first few studies of that, I was starting to notice that I'm giving people really simple and constrained movement tasks to do so that I can try to map the EMG signals, which are the electrical signals in your muscles, to the motion that they were producing. And what I saw is even for the same given task, the position trajectories, the EMG signals, the forces varied significantly, even when the motion was constrained. So, for example, I did a study where we just did elbow flexion extension. It was in a device that constrained you from moving in 3 dimensions. We trained the individuals at the speeds that they should move. We tried it with different masses. And so I laid out all these different parameters of a constrained movement task of a single joint in a single direction, back and forth flexion extension of the elbow. And what I found was that even after training, people's repeatability of motion was massive. What I mean by that is they did, 10 repetitions And if you look at the trajectories of each repetition and laid them over each other, there's big differences between them. And so that emphasized to me that just humans don't have the ability to understand and then perform motion at a in a very repeatable way and at a very fine level of fidelity. When we move more with a goal in mind and an approximation, and our body through our senses grabs data from the environment and forces that are applied to us, and then we update our approximation as we go, but we're never controlling things at a very fine movement level, at least when you look at it across repetitions of the same motion. That's where you start to see these deviations happen. Anyways, all of that is just to say that that is why I think the analysis at the level of the motion pattern or above is appropriate. Now, even with, when I did these studies, I'm using, technology, I'm using different types of sensors. And even if I had that data as a coach, I had it in real time, it'd be very hard for me to interpret the data in real time and give the athlete the suggestions. And that's just because it will take processing time for me to understand what's going on, think about what the ideal trajectory should be for whatever I'm looking at. And if I'm looking at multiple things, now I have to have all that in my brain as well. And then I have to translate that into cues for the athlete that actually gets them to change their behavior to produce trajectories that match what are desired. So even with this technology, it's kind of reaching the limits of human perception and the ability to do this kind of coaching in real time. But that doesn't mean we can't still analyze things at a higher level. And for this study, and as you'll see for the book, I'm keeping at the level of patterns. So motion patterns and effort patterns. And then I even take it one level above that, which is classes of patterns. So basically, we take, say, motion patterns, we take different ones and we group them together and we try to have a meaningful analysis between the classes of motion patterns. And in the next study, effort patterns. Okay, with all that in mind, let's get into the study now. So, in the previous chapter, the previous episode, I studied the strongman skill set, and I found out that in that data set there were 74 unique skills. Now, keep in mind, in that study, I defined the skill as only the motion pattern and implement combination. There wasn't enough data to describe the effort patterns. Some events might have said max deadlift. I know it's a maximum effort, but some just said deadlift, and then you don't know if it's maximum, repeated, if it's a medley, what have you. So that part was left out of that study. So, anyways, there was 74 unique combinations of implements and motion patterns, and I knew from performing other scientific studies that if I tried to compare between each of those 74, pairs of motion patterns, that I wouldn't have near enough data to come to some statistically significant, result. When you have that many groups to compare between, you need a massive sample size in order to have enough power in your study to try to find some statistically significant meaning in the data. Okay, so I knew if I wanted to do any kind of analysis of skills, because they're so varied in the sport of strongman, because there's so much potential to have hundreds or thousands of different variations. I knew that I needed to create less sets of things to compare between. So I have 74. Is there, with that first study, sorry, I had 74 unique skills. Is there some way where I can put those into groups and then do a comparison between a smaller, um, set of groups? Something that where I might actually have enough data to find any statistically significant differences between those groups. So that's basically what I did. I decided that I needed to classify motion patterns. Now, in the last study, I refer to them as skills, and I described why they're really just the motion patterns and the implement combinations. So I took those and I said, I need to get these into a smaller set. How do I do that? So basically, I need to make groups or classes of them. Now, the good thing about classifying them is that it's very hard to pick between 74 different things. If I just laid 74 skills out on the table and I said, train them and train them optimally, and you don't know anything else about them, and you're just like, maybe you pick what's familiar, maybe you pick randomly. But if I gave you 9 things or 3 things, you'd have a much easier time choosing between what you should do. So classifying things means that there'll be less to choose from practically. And also, like I said, those groups, less groups to compare between, gives us a better chance of finding some statistical, something statistically meaningful. The other thing we know about training is that we have all these skills, but a lot of these skills have carryover from them to other skills. For example, if I train my barbell deadlift, then to some degree, my axial deadlift will improve. My 18-inch, silver dollar deadlift will improve. My car deadlift will improve. Now, the amounts they improve based on the improvement in the barbell deadlift is going to vary, right? But we know that there's some, fairly good reasoning and evidence behind if I improve one, some others will improve at some rate. Whether that's the desirable rate or not, that's to be determined for the exact scenario you're looking at. But at least we know that this concept of similarity or carryover between skills exists, and we can use that in this system of classifying motion patterns. So all of this is good. I know that I needed to classify motion patterns into classes. I call them classes here, but think of them as groups if you want. So, first place I went to was the scientific literature. I couldn't be the first person to try to classify motion patterns, could I? Maybe not. What about for strongman? Has anyone done that specifically? Well, I looked in the literature and I could only find one study. I found that no one has, at least what I could find, attempted to look at all of the skills. So that's kind of like a precursor. You need that before you can then get into classifying them. In the literature, I couldn't find the first part. So there's no one who had laid out like, here's a data set and here's all the skills that people would have, had to compete on if they did all of these competitions. So that wasn't there. So I assumed there was nothing about classifying motion. Now, I was wrong. There was one study by Hindle et al. Where they did a systematic review of strongman studies or articles where they included biomechanical aspects of those movements. Now, the purpose was, to do this review. In the review, though, they ended up classifying the different skills into 3 different classes. So let me just grab them here. Those 3 different classes were carrying/walking skills. The second class was pulling skills. And the third class was static lifts. So I was right. Somebody else had, tried to classify this. Now, maybe not for the purposes I was looking at, but there it was. So that they basically came up with 3 classes. So you see here, taking 74 skills, bringing them down to 3 classes is a lot easier for your brain to reason about, and obviously a lot easier for you to make decisions about. And when you're not, leading right up to a competition where you know all the exact skills, having, less things to pick from makes it easier because there's this uncertainty you're, burdened with. You have to train something. And as long as you're, having the right priorities of these different categories, should be, preparing generally well for the sport until you know those exact skills. And obviously you can switch to those when the time comes. All right. Anyways, there's Hindle and colleagues made this study. They have this class, these three classes: carrying, pulling, and static lifts. However, I found some problems with this. So some skills didn't really fit nicely into this framework. For example, the sandbag throw, what category does that go in? Walking or carrying, pulling, or static lifts? It doesn't fit well into there. Tire flip, same thing. You're not carrying the tire, you're not pulling the tire, you're not statically lifting the tire. And then that's another problem. What does static lift mean? I know we know what it means colloquially, but maybe that's not a good enough definition. And then another one I thought of was Hercules hold. So you're being stretched out like an ancient torture device in between two pillars that are falling away from you. So you're not carrying anything there. You're not really pulling, as in like moving an object, because you're just like holding it in a single position. Is it a static lift? Well, are you lifting something? You're more keeping something from falling. Maybe that counts, maybe it doesn't. But you see here, there's these skills that raise these questions about this categorization. So that's where I was at. And then finally, I thought static lifts was too broad. So static lifts could cover everything that's not carrying and pulling. So a deadlift is a movement pattern that's a static lift. A squat is, well, those two right there are pretty different. What about an overhead press? That's pretty different from the other two as well. What about a bench press? I know we don't do bench press much in strongman, but it does come up. And so that's why I thought even the word static lifts, what does it mean? And I think it's a bit too broad. So that was where I was at. There's one study with three classes, and I don't think that they fit the sport very well. I think we can do better. So I decided to propose my own classification system. And that was basically the first part of the study, was proposing it, using it to classify the data. And then the second part of the study was like performing the analysis on those classes of data that I had categorized in the first part of the study. Okay, so let me describe the data set I used and how that first part of the study was performed. So I used the same data set that I had used in the previous study, which we discussed in episode 4, the previous episode. Basically, to recap here, I took amateur competition event descriptions from 2015 to 2019 in Ontario, Canada, and I extracted the skills and then I tallied up the counts. So, for example, every time log press came up, it got one count. And I called those the occurrence count. So, how many times they occurred across the data set that was taken. So that was the first part of the data set that I used, but I wanted to expand it. And that was because I had one particular question, which we'll get to. But I added another part to this data set, which was using professional data. So what I did was I took the contest event descriptions from the World Strongest Man Heats, the World Strongest Man Finals, and the Arnold Strongman Classic from 2012, so 2012 to 2023. And I added those as well. So I did the same kind of analysis. I took the event descriptions and I classified them into skills. So, like I mentioned previously, if there's a medley and it has a yoke and a log press, then those are classified into two separate skills, one for yoke walk and one for log press, and they get their own occurrence counts, right? So I did that kind of an analysis for the professional, data set, and I aggregated them together in one data set. But obviously, there's labels for amateur and labels for professional. So we could answer, one of these questions, which I'll get into in a minute here. So that was the data set I used. And then basically I had three, kind of analyses or parts to this study. The first one was the motion classification. So I took, first I came up with a motion classification system. I'll describe in a minute, but basically I came up with a set of 9 classes of motion patterns. And in this first part of the study, I sorted all those skills or classified them into this new structure of 9 classes. So basically, all of those skill occurrences were aggregated into the 9 different motion classes, and their occurrence counts were aggregated as well. So, one of the classes was deadlift. And so every deadlift skill, amateur, professional, all got aggregated into deadlift. And then all of the occurrence counts got aggregated together to represent the occurrence rate or count of the deadlift motion pattern class. Now, in the second part of the study, I basically took that data set that I just described and I performed some statistical analyses on it. So, first of all, I did an analysis to determine, is there a difference between the distribution of motion pattern classes that was observed and an equal distribution? And so, why did I pick an equal distribution? Because we might expect that given a large enough sample size and enough time, that there might be an even distribution of these skills or these motion pattern classes. Now, why that might be is because in strongman, there's no constraints on what skills can be used. And often promoters are pushing the boundaries and trying to innovate and create new skills. So that's why it's a reasonable assumption in my mind to think that given, enough randomness and time, that we might have an equal distribution. So I did an analysis to compare the one that was observed in the data set to an equal one to see if there's any significant difference between the two. And that'll have some implications on our training, which we'll discuss in a minute. And then the other statistical analysis I did was to determine, is there a difference between the observed distribution of motion pattern classes for the amateur data set and the professional data set. And so basically what I'm trying to understand there is, at the motion pattern class level, is there a different priority that professional athletes should consider compared to amateur athletes? And so we'll discuss those in a second as well. All right, now the details you've been waiting for, I'm sure, the results of the study. So let's go in order. Let's talk about the first part of the study first. So I proposed 9 motion pattern classes that I thought, through iteration, they covered all of the skills that I analyzed. So, I started with a few classes, and then obviously this expanded as more and more data was processed. And the end result is 9 motion pattern classes. And so I'll show you here, and we'll go through each one. But they are in order: carry, press, deadlift, load, push, pull, flip, throw, grip, hold, and squat. So those are the 9 that I put together that I thought, based on the intent of the task, fit together pretty well. So let me describe each one for you here. There is descriptions in the book for you. I'll put those up now so you can follow along. But check them out if you're not sure what I mean by each of these. Keep in mind here, I base these off of the intent. Maybe you have some other arguments for how these should be changed, but this is what I would propose. If you propose something different, let me know. I'm happy to discuss it with you. Okay, so let's go through them here. So, carry. The intent is for the athlete to take an object and move that object down a course. Now, here we're thinking things like yoke walk, farmer's walk, shield carry. All of those have in common is that the athlete picks something up, moves it to a new position at some specified point. In strongman, we're usually at the shortest dealing with 40, 50 feet. And then, I've seen farmers walks up to 200 feet. But either way, in all those cases, you're taking this implement and you're moving it down the course, whatever the course may be, that doesn't matter. That's the kind of abstract motion intent here for carry. Okay? Now we go to press. The goal at the press is to take some object from the floor, or sometimes it's from a raised surface. For example, log press is usually done off of crash mats, foam mats. But anyways, you're going to take this from some position, usually below your knees, lift it up to your shoulders, and then press it to arm's length overhead. And, if you're in competition, you hold it at the top, you get a down signal, you can put it down. So that's the press one. Let's move on. Now we get to deadlifts. Probably most people are familiar with this movement, but essentially you're going to have something that's resting on the floor or an elevated surface. You're going to grab it with two hands and you're going to lift it, producing most of the force from your lower body, from whatever height it is at, up to your hip height. And you're going to have your knees, your torso, everything in a nice erect position, and then you're going to get a down signal and put it down. So now there's lots of variety here. I mentioned things like car deadlifts. There's different deadlift apparatuses, but anyways, that's the spirit of the deadlift, the intent of the general motion pattern or motion pattern class. Okay, next is the load. So for load, essentially what the athlete has to do is take some object. Typically it's laying on the floor, but it could again be on a raised surface. And you're going to pick it up, usually into your lap if it's heavy, and then up to your chest. And then you're going to put that object either up onto a platform or up and over some other implement. So for example, we have a sandbag load over yoke, or we call it sandbag over bar. So you're going to actually pick the sandbag up and you're going to put it over the bar. Usually that's done for repetition, so you go back and forth over the bar. Versus we have an Atlas stone run. So basically you're going to take different size Atlas stones and put them up on platforms. Now either one of these could go back and forth the other way, where the sandbag could go to a platform, the Atlas stone could go over a bar, it doesn't matter. But the intent here is that you're taking something from the ground and putting it up onto or over something. Okay, so that's the load motion pattern. Next is push-pull. Now, I know right away some of you are thinking why aren't push and pull two different things? So a few thoughts here. First of all, pulling is the dominant, motion intent in strongman. We pull tractor trailers or vehicles. We do arm over arm pulls with sleds. We drag sleds or big boat chains. I've seen dragging tires. All of those things are usually pulling. Whether you're, facing the object or you're facing away from it, doesn't matter. You're pulling them. Now, I have seen in my career, although it happens very rarely, pushes. One of these, at the professional level would be like the Titans turntable. And there's a few of these or the wheel of pain, where basically athletes have to push the object. Typically it's, down a course, whatever that course may be. If it's a wheel of pain, obviously the course is a circle. If it's a truck pull, the course is usually linear and it's 100 feet or, something similar like that, right? 20 meters, 30 meters. Those are the kind of motion intents that I thought fit well together. Whether you're pulling it or pushing it, the goal is for the athlete to take the object and move it down the course where the object, is in contact with the ground. So there's some frictional force there you're trying to overcome. Versus carrying, where you actually pick up the object, it's not dragging on the ground, it's above the ground and you're moving it down the course. So that's kind of the difference between those two. And that's why I put push-pull together, because I thought the motion intent was so similar, whether you're actually pushing on it or you're pulling it, you're trying to get the same kind of job done typically. Okay, so that's the fifth motion class. Move on to the sixth, flip. So flip doesn't happen as often in strongman, but it comes up in a few different forms. So basically, the goal or the motion intent with flipping is to take an object and turn it end over end. So examples of this would be tire flip. The tire's laying flat on the ground. You're going to put your chest on it and drive it up until it turns end over end, so that the side you are touching flips over the other side and away from you. Same thing with a fingers event. There's this big long pole, you get on one end of it, and you basically flip it 180 degrees. So those are another one is a car flip, which I've been fortunate to do before. Very dangerous, very fun when you get it done. Typically, car flip can be, I've seen it done in different ways. World's Strongest Man, I think in the 90s, they were flipping cars 90 degrees or 180 degrees in sand, I remember. So that's one. When I had to do a car flip, it was actually a 360-degree flip. So maybe that's a bit different there. But typically the flips we see are 180 degrees at a time. And so that's kind of the general motion intent here with flipping, is taking something from one side and then flipping it end over end. All right, that's the flip. Next is the throw. So in strongman, we have a few different throws. I'd say a lot of them aren't very common anymore. The throw we see most is usually a keg toss or a sandbag toss, which is basically the same kind of thing. We're going to stand in front of some banner and we're going to take, a sandbag or a keg, swing it between our legs, and throw it up and behind us and up over the standard, right? Now, the general concept here is just that for throwing, since there are other versions, I'll talk about in a second, that the athlete takes an implement and throws it down a course or over something. Okay, so we talked about the over something with the kind of standard sandbag keg toss throws that we see. The keg toss world record was just broken last year. Pretty exciting stuff. Some really good throwers, some crazy heights, launching kegs into orbit almost, which is really cool to see. But other throws I've seen are more like shot put style or forward facing. So, for example, in some strongman competitions, and I think this is borrowed from Highland Games a lot, we have the stone put. So basically, you're gonna hold a stone at your shoulder and just throw it forward. I think at the Arnold Strongman Classic 2 years ago, we saw this. What was it called? Some kind of the stain and toss. I forget, but basically where they take a big, Atlas stone looking thing above their head and throw it forward like that into a pit of sand. That's another kind of throw. But so those are more forward facing. Another one I've seen is a tire throw. So you take like a normal sized tire off your car and you throw it down a course. I've actually had to do that one myself a couple times. So there's these different ways to throw, but the intent here is basically to take an object and throw it down a course or over something. Okay, so that's the throw. All right, second last one here, grip hold. Now there's a few skills I saw, movement patterns, and I put them together in here because they all rely on manipulating something with your hands. Sometimes, though, it's an active movement. So, for example, like a phone book tear, which I've only ever seen in one contest, or like a horseshoe bend. It's really relying on your grip, but you're actively movement. You're not holding like an isometric, right? So those are the kind of grip events I'm talking about. Maybe like an anvil, deadlift, for example, might be another one where it's really grip dominant. And they occur in strongman contests, not so much recently, but back when I started, they happened a lot more. So that's kind of the grip portion. The hold portion, which also relies on your grip, here I'm thinking things like any kind of isometric. So like a Hercules hold, obviously there's the grip is in there, but you're holding, you're maintaining an isometric contraction. Some other ones for holds would be like a car deadlift hold, or like a front hold, or a lateral hold. Probably seen some of those at big contests. So those things were all categorized into this class of implements. So the goal here is just the athlete is going to use their grip and manipulate an object or hold it in place. Last one here, the squat. I think the squat probably most people are familiar with, but the abstract intent here is that the athlete stands tall, stands erect with some object typically bearing on their shoulders, bends their knees and squats down to some desired depth, whatever that is. We don't have to get into arguing about depth here with strongman. I can hear you guys already, chirping about it. And then stands up erect again. And that's basically it. That's what constitutes the squat. And then strongman squat doesn't happen very often, especially for amateurs. Happens more often for professionals. I'm thinking about JF Caron's big squat he had a few years ago before he blew his knees out. So it's nice to see those apparatuses. Our world's strongest man always has those like lever squats with the kegs being loaded on there. Very cool stuff. In amateurs, probably the squat you usually get is a car squat, or you get a squat where it's either a barbell or an axle, and it's like a platform squat, or most people call it a strongman style squat, where you have to go down, you have to touch the implements to some platforms, and then you can stand back up. So those are the kind of skills I'm thinking here that I categorized into this squat motion pattern class. All right, so with the data set I had, basically I had 591 amateur skills and I had 235 professional skills that I categorized into this, new motion pattern classification system with the 9 classes that I just laid out. So that was the kind of first part of the study, right? Just kind of getting the data together in these motion pattern classes. So then I could go on to the statistical analyses. Okay, so let's talk about those now. So the first thing I did was kind of look at the occurrence counts for each of these motion pattern classes just overall before digging into it. What I found, which I will show you guys here, is the carry motion pattern class accounts for 24% of all the skill occurrences. So do you understand? Carry is a quarter of what strongman do. So should I say it again? Carrying is a quarter of what strongman do. So get good at carrying. There's a lot, and probably part of this is there's lots of variety in carrying. It can be in medleys, it could be single skills. It could be, the farmer's walk frames you're holding in your hand. It could be a yoke on your back. It could be a sandbag, a stone. It could be so many things. It could be multiple things you have to carry. You might have to carry them and then load them, like we saw recently with the sandbag steeplechase. You carry a sandbag, then you load it over the bar, and you pick it up again, and you just try not to die while you're finishing that event. Anyways, carrying is basically a quarter of what strongmen do. Now, at the other end, we have the squat, which is why I mentioned it last. I mentioned them in order of occurrence counts. Squat occurs the least often across the whole data set at 2.7% of all the skills that were analyzed. So, and now I don't have the numbers here, but I believe most of that percentage actually is attributed to the professional contest. In the amateur contest, there's hardly any squats, like I mentioned before. So that hopefully that gives you a bit of the ends of the spectrum here. We have carrying, which is the most, with almost a quarter of everything, and we have squats with less than 3%. Look at press. Pressing is almost as much. It happens almost as much as carrying. Now, between the two, we're almost at 50% of the occurrence counts across the data set. Should I say that one again too? Carrying and pressing account for almost 50% of what strongmen are tested on. So please, if you learn nothing else from this video series, get good at carrying, get good at pressing, and you're going to do okay. That basically means 50% of the time you'll be, prepared, at least generally. Okay? All right. So that was kind of the overall. Now, what I did do is I also looked at this data year by year. So I'll show you here the figure year by year. You can see from this that there is actually a lot of variability. So you can see, for example, that the carry motion pattern class was 29% in 2016. So almost, a third of all the skills tested were carry in that year. But in 2013, it was 15%. So I hope that shows you just like the variability that can happen in these motion pattern classes. Now, I'm showing you here for the data set I used, which is, I think, a decent sized one. But you can imagine if you looked at your own regional data or you looked at different time periods at these, there's going to be variation here. So something to account for. But in general, you can see the trends here. Carry is, almost always the most. And then we have squats, grip, which is almost always the least. So another point on that is that you see that the throw, flip, and grip hold were not tested at all in some of the years. So that's kind of the extent of the variability there. It's like there's lots of these patterns, but some of them aren't tested at all. And that makes it difficult. Should you train those things? Well, in the years where they're not tested at all, probably not, but you can't predict it. This is all retrospective, right? We're looking back. So I would say you should still throw them in here or there, but obviously they should be, prioritized accordingly to how much resources you want to spend preparing those things versus things like the carry and the press. Okay, so let's get into the statistical analysis that I was, discussing. The first one where I said we wanted to compare between the observed distribution and an equal distribution of motion pattern classes. Now, to compare between these, I'm converted these to percentages. So, for example, what we would do is take how many occurrence counts there are for the carry motion pattern class, and we divide them by the total number of skill occurrences, and obviously multiply that by 100, you get your percentage. So that's how I came up with these percentages. Now, the conclusion from this statistical analysis showed that there is a significant difference between the observed distribution of motion pattern classes and an equal distribution. And I'll show it here again, but you saw the percentages. They're not all the same, right? So if we have 9 motion pattern classes, we should be able to take 100 divided by 9, and then we should have the same. That's not the case. We saw carry was almost, carry and press are almost 50%, squats, flips, throws, grip hold, sometimes they're 0%. And so you see that no matter the year, that there's a difference between the observed distribution and an equal one. So what does this mean? This confirms that athletes should not be allocating their time equally to all of these different motion pattern classes or the underlying skills that fit into each of these motion pattern classes. So that might sound intuitive, but that's good. Now you have this study to back up that intuition, right? So finally, statistical analysis was performed between the amateur portion of the data set and the professional portion of the data set. Now, the conclusion here is that there are statistically significant dependencies between the observed distributions and the level of competition, whether it's amateur or professional. So, what does this suggest? You might have thought this naturally, but basically it suggests that the priority of motion pattern classes, their distribution, should change whether it's for amateurs or professionals. So if I just look at the averages overall between the amateurs and the professionals, and I take the occurrence rates of each one's, I can, on average, I'll tell you what the ordering should be in terms of priority. So for amateurs, it's what we already described. It's carry, press, deadlift, load, push, pull, flip, throw, grip, hold, squat. So the order that we already talked about. But for professionals, on average, press is first, then carry, load, deadlift, push, pull, throw, squat, flip, and grip hold. So you see squat moved up a couple places where it was in last place for amateurs here. So that's on average, those would be the prioritization based on the occurrence rates for amateurs versus professionals. And so that's like important to consider because you don't want to, look, you're an athlete, you have limited time and resources. If you know that there's a difference in how you're tested as an amateur compared to professional athletes, whatever bucket you're in, you should specialize in that because it's going to give you the best performance. You're going to be able to optimize your training and your performance when you cater to those things. And so that's kind of the takeaway here. Just in summary here for the results, what happened? First, I proposed a new motion pattern classification system. There's 9 motion pattern classes, which we went through. This is the first study showing that there's a significant difference between the distribution that's observed and an equal distribution. And like I said, that means that we should not be distributing skills in an equal manner. They should be prioritized differently than equal. And we can use occurrence counts, so how often they occur in the past, to drive our training decisions forward. Okay, so there's that. And then this is also the first study to show that the distribution of motion pattern classes is different for amateurs versus professionals. So that means that, like I said, if you're an amateur or a professional, specialize. Pick that prioritization that you will be tested on and make your training as optimal for that as possible. So, all this is wonderful, by the way. It feels great just explaining it to you. When I found these results, I was so excited. I mentioned in the previous episode how I was kind of disappointed after my first study. There's some really good conclusions there, right? But I could only perform descriptive statistics, so basically looking at averages and stuff, which is very helpful actually. But inferential statistics are what helps you take some data set and feel more confident about that it will apply to some future or different data set. So I was very excited to see some statistically significant, differences here that can help us to prioritize our training or understand how we should lay it out, at least at the level of motion pattern classes. Like I mentioned before, I think the sample size has to be much larger if we want to step back a level to motion patterns and not motion pattern classes. But anyways, this still gives us a couple of firsts, and it gives us some things that help us change how our training can be set up, and hopefully optimize it for those strongman competitions that we want to place well in or win or whatever the goals are. All right, I want to address one more thing before we move on to the limitations. So that was, I want you to keep in mind that you probably, like me, heard these conclusions about the statistical analyses and thought, yeah, duh, of course that's what it is. That's great. I thought similarly, and then I had the results, kind of confirm the intuition. And that's good. Please don't think about it like, yeah, duh, obviously that's what the case is. Now, there's a scientific study to back up your intuition. So you had some intuition that that's the way it was, but you couldn't say, with a good amount of certainty that that's what it would be or cross different data sets than what it would be. But now you have a study that you can lean on. So the next time someone comes and criticizes your, training plan, why are you doing that? Why are you doing this, man? Why are you prioritizing that? Doesn't make any sense. You can just slam a copy of my book on their desk and say, "Here, go argue with Dr. Desplenner," and I'll have you back. All right, as always, we got to talk about limitations. Remember, a good scientist always knows their limitations, knows the limitations of their studies. I'm not claiming I'm a good scientist, but I know that we should talk about limitations. So let's get into it. The first one, and obviously this is a recurring theme for these studies, but kind of for science in general, is that this data set, here's the general disclaimer. This data set may not represent reality. It may not represent some larger population of samples. It may not represent the whole population of samples or different time periods, right? And so that's something very important to take away. Now, the data, like why this is because the data set didn't include all strongman skills ever tested, right? There was no mooring bit carry. Um, there was, actually, there probably was a plane pull not in the amateur data set though. So there's these like skills that weren't included, and also, like I said, in strongman, there's no standards or guidance. So people are just making crazier and crazier contraptions, which is really cool as an athlete and as a fan. But in terms of analyzing the data, it makes it harder. So this data set did not obviously contain all strongman skills ever. Okay. It also only like the amateur data only contained data from Ontario, Canada, so one region. Now, like I mentioned before, Ontario breeds world class strongman athletes. So I would say we prepare our athletes pretty well for that. So that's a good sign. But it doesn't mean other regions wouldn't have different data. And also, it's only 5 years worth of data, right? So trends change, like the equipment changes, the promoters' desires change, all that stuff, right? It's going to change it. And then also on the professional side, it didn't include all the competitions. In this study, I didn't include the Shaw Classic, the Road Invitational, Magnus for Magnuson, the Strongman Classic, Strongman Championship League, Giants live shows. I didn't include any of that stuff. And also, I didn't include even all of the years that, say, World Strongest Man has gone on for, or the Arnold Strongman Classic. So, again, just a recurring and common limitation here is just that remember that the data set doesn't cover everything. So that's a limitation. Now, if you have a larger data set, let me know. As of now, I think this is the largest data set out there for this kind of study. There was 591 amateur skill counts and 235 professional. So what's that? 800 and something total skills. Pretty good, right? But obviously, we need a lot larger one because of the variability in the sport. If you have that larger data set, if you've done this analysis and you know way more than me, please let me know. I'd love to learn more. But I'm assuming that's not the case based on all of my research. So this is what we have. I think it's great, and I hope in the future it can expand on this work. All right, second limitation. And that's with the classification of motion patterns into the motion pattern classes. So, first of all, I proposed a brand new structure, so that could be a limitation. You might not agree with my structure, my definitions of the motion pattern classes. There could be some skills that actually don't fall well into the motion pattern class system that I came up with. Also, you probably could point out I put push pull together, mostly because the push portion had such a low occurrence count, and the intent was the same that I thought they should go together. But you might argue those two should be separate. Same with grip hold. Same thing. I put them together because the motion intent is very similar with using your grip. But you might argue that those should be two separate classes as well. So, anyways, that's a limitation. You might not agree, or you might have different opinions about what the actual structure should be. Also, a limitation is that you might argue with the classification that I did. For example, I classified the farmer's walk as a carry event because when it's proposed, the idea is to take an object, well, in this case, it's one in each hand, and carry it down some course, whether it's for the longest time or to a specific point as fast as possible, whatever it is. That's the goal of the event or the skill. However, in that one, the grip is a major factor. So maybe you may have said that farmer's walk isn't a carry event, it's actually a grip event. And because the farmer's walk's tested so much, if you move that into the grip hold category, then that would change the distribution, right? I don't know how significantly it would change it, but it would change it. And so that would be some limitation, as if maybe you disagree with how I classified the movement patterns. Now, in my defense, I tried to think about the intent of the skill or the motion and not the pieces of it that are used, right? And so that's how I came to the conclusion. But it's a limitation. You might not agree. So, what I would ask of you, if you have different ideas, all of the skills that I found and the classification of them can be found in Appendix A of Foundations of Strongman Training. So if you're interested, take a look in there, look at how I classified them. And if you have any other opinions, how you might have, your thoughts on why this should go over there or why one might represent two categories, whatever it is, happy to hear about it. Check it out in Appendix A and let me know. The last limitation, which is probably a pretty universal one here, especially for me with strongman and the variability we have. But this probably applies to any kind of human studies because of the variability. But that limitation is sample size. So I kind of mentioned before in my previous study, I knew based on the number of classes that I did not have, a large enough sample size. Even in this study, there were some indications of that. And so let me tell you about that. So, I said this is the largest data set, but I think we still might need some more data set to have even more, to find if there's any further distinction between these motion pattern classes. So, why I say that is because I told you about the statistical analyses I did kind of at like a broad level. But what we commonly do in scientific studies is then we look at pairwise comparisons, right? So I looked at overall distributions, right, of one of what was observed versus an equal distribution for say, uh, for example. But then what we do is do what we call post hoc analysis, where we have tighter constraints and we look at those at a pair by pair level. So what happened I did that as I would do with all studies where it's appropriate. And what I found was that those statistically significant findings that happened at the overall level disappeared when I went to a pairwise level. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't some statistically significant differences there between those, pairs of motion pattern classes and whatever variables we're comparing them against. But what it does mean is that given the sample size, we weren't able to find them. So, again, just like I said, sample size is a limitation. And until we can get a larger data set, then this will continue to be a limitation. And we won't be able to get more fine grained conclusions where you can have some statistical confidence about and apply those to your training. All right, before we wrap up here with some conclusions, I wanted to discuss some practical considerations of the findings of this study. So I'm sure you can kind of understand the general results and already think about, okay, how should I structure my training? But I wanted to highlight here how this might help you with the uncertainty, principle that is part of strongman. So at times of uncertainty, what I mean is you're either not in a competitive mode, so we might call that the off season, or you're in competition mode, but you don't know the details of the event yet, right? So, for example, like you went to World's Strongest Man last year and you are already qualified, or you're doing a qualifier to go the next year. So you know you're going to get there, but you have no idea what the events are. So there's a lot of uncertainty, right? What do you train, right? At times like that, that's where something like motion pattern class distributions can be helpful. So if you looked at the data, say in that example, just for World's Strongest Man, you might be able to use the past data to try to predict what will happen next year. And it might be off. You could be wrong. But anyways, that you could do that and use the motion pattern class distributions to help you decide what to train. So if you looked at, World's Strongest Man finals and you said, okay, they have whatever it might be, let's make up something. They do carry 25% of the time. So you know that contest is far away, but you better be getting good at carrying events 25% of your time, because that's the likelihood it's going to be tested. Unless you're the best at carrying, which at that level, everyone's the best, and it's like the margin for error is really small. So you probably should train it anyways. But that's one case in uncertainty. So off season situations like that, where you might just default to the motion pattern classes. So what I mean by that is, if you train one carry, the other ones are going to get better. So as long as you're training some kind of carry, let's say 25% of the time, then you're going to be prepared, right? And when you're kind of in an uncertain spot, it's really hard. How do you optimize for unknowns or uncertainty? Good luck. You find a solution to that, you'll be a rich person. So what you do is you just know that I know I have, like, using the motion pattern class data we have, I know I need to be training this thing about this much percentage of the time, or it will be tested this much percentage of the time. So I should train accordingly. And then you just cycle through different, let's say in this case, carry. You just cycle through different carry skills. So you do a yoke walk, then next week you do a farmer's walk, then next week you do a sandbag carry. And you just like keep rotating through those things so that you're touching each one of them every once in a while. But overall, you're just getting good at carrying things no matter what they are. And that's basically the approach you have to take when you don't know what will be tested, right? So that's where this, kind of helps in. And another practical consideration for your training, and this is more, I'd say, for advanced athletes, but coaches, you might just opt to program motion pattern classes for your athletes. Now, this could work for more general populations as well. But I won't go into that here. If we focus with athletes, though, when they're advanced, they've been, say, in strongman, like we're talking about, for a long time. They know their bodies. And in off season, especially, where there's like uncertainty about what skills exactly will need to be, trained, then you could just give athletes a motion pattern class. So, like, as their main lift, you could just list out deadlift, and you know that athlete knows their body well enough and their weaknesses and where they should be training. And maybe with your guidance, you can leave it up to them to pick the exact variation of deadlift for each of those sessions that you want them to deadlift in. So you just say, hey, I need you to deadlift. I need you, say, to give this kind of an effort, whatever that might be. Maybe it's a speed day, maybe it's a maximal effort, but it just has to be those parameters, and you let them regulate the training themselves. What's really good about that is advanced athletes know their body really well. So they're they probably have made poor decisions enough times that they're able to make good decisions now. And you can leave it to them to decide. They'll get in the gym and they know, like, shit, this isn't feeling good. Okay, I better not pull that deadlift from the floor today. My lower back is like really hurting. Let's do an elevated pull. Um, maybe, maybe they're having trouble locking out or something like that. So maybe they know, okay, actually, I'm going to add bands, and that's going to help me pull through right at the top of the last portion of the motion. Anyways, things like that, where you could just program a motion pattern class and you have athletes that could take it away. Now, for the general population, it could work too, but you would just have to, like, go through a lot more training with how to make good choices, but I might make it fun, right? Coach says I just need to deadlift, and so I get to pick whatever I want. Maybe it's a dumbbell deadlift today or something, right? So you see how it can leave it open for variability, but obviously you have to have the right person and personality that can handle that kind of responsibility. Otherwise, and you probably know yourself how easy it is to overtrain, do stupid shit, cause injuries, and so got to be careful with this. But I just want to highlight that this is an opportunity to do that. Okay, finally, here as well for practical considerations, keep in mind that the numbers I've shown you, the numbers that are laid out in the book, they're just averages, right? So that table I showed you about the occurrence rates, those are just the averages overall. Now they provide a baseline, right? So if you didn't know how to prioritize it all, and you're looking for a method, just copy the table, right? So carry was 24%, squat was 2.7%, and everything in between, and you're an amateur, start there. Just lay out your training in those percentages and then adjust as needed. So these numbers give you kind of like a guideline to start with. But that doesn't eliminate the need for individualization. Also, you could just take the same kind of process I did if you're willing and get your own data set. So maybe you don't live in Ontario, Canada, and you're not an amateur like I do. Maybe you're a professional female athlete from China. Okay, that could be. So you could take the data from your region, your career trajectory, and do the same analysis to come up with those occurrence rates. And then you would use that as your guideline. And obviously, you have to individualize, right? So, like I'm telling you, in competition for amateurs, or actually overall, the carry, motion pattern class was tested 24% of the time. But if you're the best at carrying in the world already, you don't have to spend 24% of your time on it. You would individualize, right? So if that's you, and maybe squatting, which was the least prevalent, that's your worst event, and carrying's your best, maybe you actually switch those things completely opposite. You spend 25% of your time on squatting and 3% of your time carrying because you're so good at it. You don't need to train all the time. You just need to tackle it here and there to keep your efficiency up, to keep you familiar with the movements. So, again, just a baseline. Don't be an idiot. Use your head. You got to individualize it. Okay. All right. All right, thanks for hanging in there with me. Now, let's get to the conclusions. The main takeaways here is it is possible to deal with the uncertainty through using motion pattern classes. So, and I don't know if you know how big of a win that is. If you train strongman, if you coach it, you know. But for everyone else, this is a huge idea, right? Instead of just putting skills on the wall and throwing darts at them to kind of decide what you should do in the off season or in season when you don't know the events, this study and the findings give you a guideline, at least where to start, right? One for amateur, there's some difference for professional in terms of priority, but it gives you something to start with. You don't have to just throw darts at the wall. You can, that could be fun too, as long as it's not your wall and you don't have to drywall it after. But it gives you a place to start. The other takeaway here is that you should train the motion pattern classes and obviously the underlying motion patterns that occur most often. So remember, in the last episode, I laid out the foundational skills. Those are the ones that occurred multiple times per year, every year for the data set we found. Those ones should be trained all the time. You should become the best at those. If I remember correctly, they accounted for over 70% of all the skill occurrences was those 14 foundational skills. Same thing is applied here to motion pattern classes, is that train the ones that occur more often because you're more likely to be tested on the ones that occur more often, right? No brainer here, right? If carry happens to be tested a quarter of the time, I better get good at carrying because it's going to come up a lot and I got to be ready for it. I mean, unless you're just, you know, lollygagging into strongman and you don't really care the outcomes, okay, whatever, train what you want. But if you're trying to optimize training here, optimize performance, then at least start prioritizing which ones occur more often. And then obviously, like I said, you got to individualize it and combine that with what do your strengths and weaknesses dictate you need to train. All right. So those are the main takeaways. Now, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you like the insights. You know, a couple of first time insights here that now there's a scientific study you guys can refer to and send all the haters my way. In the next episode, I'm going to, like I said, discuss the other half of this equation. So we have skills, motion patterns, effort patterns. I'm actually going to discuss a study I did on effort patterns. At the start, I talked about how I wanted to, kind of take the two apart and look at them individually. So that's what I did. So we'll get into that next time. We'll talk about effort patterns. What are they? I had to propose some new ones. And what does the distribution of those look like? So we can do a similar thing on the effort pattern side as we discussed here today with the motion patterns. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Take care.